Let me just say that California is kind of being a Libra today in that she can't decide whether she wants to be sunny or cloudy, and that is out of my control. So if the lighting changes, so fucking be it. Bibliophiles of the internet, today I am risen from the dead to bring you my March wrap-up. March was a very interesting reading month for me in more ways than one. I did have a short work trip at the end of the month, and then the literal moment I got back home, I got incredibly sick. So I'm still turning the corner, still trying to feel fully human again, but let's talk about the very strange collection of books I read in March. The first book I finished in March was my galley of Now I Surrender by Alvaro Enrique. I read about half of it with my eyeballs and finished with the audiobook, which is read by Tom Rivera, and this came out on March 3rd from Riverhead Books. This is not an easy book to summarize, so bear with me, but it's basically split into three main points of view, two historical and one present day. And basically the catalyst is a Mexican woman fleeing into the desert after surviving a devastating raid on her late husband's ranch. She ends up in the contested borderlands between Mexico and the US known as Apacheria, where various Apache nations made their home, which obviously makes her recapture somewhat complicated. And we're also following the Mexican lieutenant who's been charged with bringing her back. Content warnings for explorations of anti-indigenous violence and colonial violence, including use of anti-indigenous slurs and language, descriptions of imprisonment and torture, scenes involving animal injury and death, and some use of homophobic slurs. I'm just going to start by saying that this is not a book that you can read passively or casually. It demands your attention, your focus, and even a bit of work because it's written and structured in a way that I would say doesn't immediately feel intuitive. There are no chapters, no headers, very few section breaks, no quotation marks, and the story is primarily told from three perspectives that we cycle through in no specific order. So there's very little visually, stylistically, by which to orient yourself. I say that not to discourage anyone from reading it or to detract from what the story is doing, because it is readable, it is perfectly understandable, but I do think it takes some time to attune yourself to the rhythms of the story, and I think that's important to know if you plan to pick up this book at any point. With that said, what I appreciate most about this story is the way it celebrates and excavates a forgotten region and cultural dynamic that often gets lost within the long, ongoing legacy of what we call the border wars between Mexico and the US. There's this idea that there are only two sides involved in this issue when actually the existence of Apacheria complicated those disputes because it was a very specific region that existed beyond the jurisdiction of those two colonized countries. So centering that region and its people brings in a necessary sense of complexity and a much needed anti-colonial perspective on those conflicts. I also respect what this story has to say about how history and culture are not static concepts. Again, we try to manufacture these very clear-cut lines between where cultural identity begins and ends, who gets to claim it and who doesn't, who gets to inherit it and who doesn't, when the reality and the experience of it is so much more subjective and complex. There are characters in this story who sort of change culturally from beginning to end, not because their birthright or nationality has shifted, but because culture itself is a living, breathing form of exchange and also deeply contextual and reliant on one's circumstances. With all that in mind, though, I will say I think this book could have benefited from a heavier editorial hand. As interesting as all the pieces and perspectives are, there are definitely times where the narrative feels meandering, unfocused, and occasionally even a bit gratuitous. I don't think it would have lost anything from having a bit of a tighter structure, especially towards the end. And I also have to admit that I found the ending somewhat anticlimactic. Almost the entire story is about this desperate cat and mouse chase across the desert, and I think you would expect that to come to a head in an impactful way, and I just don't think we get that in the end. So the story definitely could have been improved in my opinion, but overall I'm still really glad I read this, and I would give it 4 stars. After that, I listened to The Red Winter by Cameron Sullivan, which came out at the end of February from Tor Books. I listened to an ALC kindly provided by Macmillan Audio, which is read by Imogen Church and Rory Barnett. This is a queer, epic, historical fantasy story that sort of reimagines the story of the first werewolf in the French countryside. It's set in 1785 and follows an immortal monster slayer named Professor Sebastian Grave, who has already faced down the terrifying Beast of Galvadon once. But he receives word that the beast has returned, and he's been called to rejoin the hunt by none other than his estranged lover, Antoine, who shares a dark history with the beast and perhaps a terrible secret with Sebastian himself. Content warnings for graphic depictions of animal injury and animal death, scenes involving graphic injury and medical content, some depictions of gore, violence, and death, experienced homophobia, and some sexual content. Surprisingly, this was a really fun, sort of tongue-in-cheek fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously. And maybe I should have picked up on that when I saw the blurb from T. Kingfisher on the cover, but even though this can be a dark, grisly fantasy at times, I would say it's definitely in the same vein as her work. What I loved most about this story was the very distinctive, personable narrative voice, as well as the deeply intimate connection between Sebastian and Salmadel, the demon he shares his soul and body with. And as you can imagine, they have a very symbiotic relationship, and the way they snark at each other and have very different opinions about how to solve their problems is just really fun to read. The story is also doing a lot of really interesting things in the way it explores the interplay between history, religion, and mythology, and how all of those things can become diluted or even conflated with each other, especially over long periods of time. That said, this is another book I think could have benefited from a heavier editorial hand. It's a bit overly long, in my opinion, to the point of feeling somewhat repetitive or circular at times. It also jumps back and forth between a few different perspectives and timelines, and I don't think the integration of those secondary and tertiary pieces feel entirely organic or seamless. I actually tuned into an author event where Cameron Sullivan was in conversation with Alexi Harrow about this book, and he mentioned how he didn't necessarily conceive the book as involving all these different points of view so much as he was really interested in those other historical periods and retroactively pieced them into the book after the fact. And unfortunately, I think that sort of shoehorning in really shows. Overall, I found this story to be enjoyable, engaging, exciting, very smartly told, but for me it did get a bit sloggy in the middle and could have stood to be a bit more focused. But I'm really excited to see what Cameron Sullivan writes next, especially if it's more historical fantasy, so I gave this one 3.75 stars. Then, on a complete whim, I decided to pick up Unwritten Rules by Katie Casey. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by one of my faves, Lee Osorio. This is a queer sports romance. It follows a professional athlete named Zach who has put a lot of years and work into becoming a professional baseball player. But he also happens to be gay, and he's made the choice to stay closeted for the time being so as not to derail his career or success. But his resolve is tested one year at spring training when he meets fellow catcher Eugenio Morales, and even though they both play the same position and are technically competing for playing time, Zach inadvertently becomes Eugenio's mentor of sorts. Sparks definitely start flying between them, but fast forward 3 years and they are no longer on the same team, they're no longer speaking to each other, but they unexpectedly reunite at the All-Star Classic. Content warnings for experienced homophobia, ableism, and racism, brief depictions of panic attacks and anxiety, and explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Zach is a disabled Jewish man who has hearing loss and uses a hearing aid, and Eugenio is Venezuelan American. This book might have been the biggest surprise for me in March. I know the cover isn't great, I know we're judging, that's fair, but I heard about this book randomly on Threads of all places, where someone was recommending Karina Press romances for fans of heated rivalry, and I have to say, this book absolutely hits all those notes. If your favorite scene in Heated Rivalry is a certain main character apologizing and saying that they really tried, this is your book. This book is for you. Trust me on this. I just loved this so much. First of all, try as I might to beat the allegations, I fear I am in fact a baseball fan. And speaking as a fan, I think you have to be at least a little bit of a fucking freak, a little bit of a fucking nerd to be able to appreciate and enjoy America's pastime. And you can tell that Katie Casey is a fucking baseball freak. I love when sports romance authors are actually fans of the sports they're writing about. They're not just using the sport as set dressing or as a jumping off point. They're not just sprinkling in terms here and there. No, they know the ins and outs of the sport, and they're going to make sure their character's passion for the sport comes through on the page. So again, Katie Casey's knowledge of the sport absolutely comes through, and comes through in a way that shows not just how much they know, but how much they care. And because of that, the story is able to beautifully balance what's at stake both professionally and romantically for the characters. I also love the way the story is structured, going back and forth between the spring training where the characters first meet and the All-Star Classic where they're unexpectedly reunited after losing touch. There's a really beautiful sense of symmetry in seeing the characters fall for each other and fall apart at the same time as you're watching them find their way back to each other in more ways than one. The chemistry between the characters is undeniable. It's electric, and there's an organic sense of tension built in between them because obviously when they first meet, they're on the same team, so they genuinely want to help each other improve to strengthen the team. But again, because they're playing the same position, they're also competing for game time and roster space. Listen, I just really love the entire experience experience of reading this story and sitting with these characters. They're so flawed, so earnest, so endearing. You can't help but want the best for both of them. And I appreciate that their happiness is not so much an inevitability, but rather something they have to actively work towards. I guess what I'm trying to say there is that the story makes it clear that happiness is not something that the characters are owed or something that can be earned. It's something you have to actively make space for in your life, and it's not something that just maintains itself. And I really appreciate that realistic perspective. This was just wonderful. It's precisely the kind of sports romance I crave and I love so much. It was also really fun and synergistic to be reading this while watching spring training games, so that was another layer to the experience. But this was fantastic. I would happily read the other 2 companion books in the series, and I gave this 4.5 stars. On a very different note, after that I read my galley of The Bodybuilders by Albertine Clark. I was kindly sent a review copy from Bloomsbury, and this one also came out in early March. This is a super weird, queer, speculative fiction story about Ada, who's felt very disconnected from herself and her life ever since her parents' divorce. One day while she's lounging by the apartment pool, she meets a man named Atticus and feels an immediate connection between them. In fact, she becomes convinced that they're somehow the same person or even living the same life in some ways. It's not until Ada decides to spontaneously join her mom on a vacation to Greece that she is abruptly jolted out of the physical world and realizes that she might be living in a body and an environment that was artificially created especially for her by some kind of unknowable entity. Content warnings for explorations of divorce, brief non-graphic references to disordered eating and excessive exercise, and brief allusions to off-page suicide. This is exactly the kind of weird-ass book that I love, and shout out to the publicist at Bloomsbury who made sure I got a copy of this in my hands. They were like, this one's for the sick, twisted little freaks, and we know exactly who needs to read it. I found this to be an incredibly propulsive story that was so easy to get swept up in. It's very much a story about exploring both the connection and disconnection between body and mind, looking at what it means to actually exist in a body in the world. When and in what ways are we actively inhabiting our bodies? In what ways is daily existence merely just performance? And I really rock with how the story goes about exploring those questions and reinforcing them stylistically through these short, blunt sentences that seem to have no relationship to each other whatsoever on the first pass. In the dialogue, the characters almost seem to be talking past each other as opposed to with each other, which also creates this floaty feeling of disconnect. And I think all of that is very intentional and effective in showing how often we default to performing our own existence, our own humanity, while feeling deeply disconnected from ourselves. So there's a lot to consider here when it comes to the formation of self. Are we a collection of choices that we've made of our own volition, or are we merely an anthology of responses to the world and people around us? Do we truly belong to ourselves? Do we create ourselves? Or are we created by our circumstances? Do we seek the company of people who encourage us to change, or who are merely different iterations of ourselves and what we already believe? These are complex questions, and I appreciate the way the story grapples with them and uses speculative elements to explore and emphasize those ideas. I do wish there was more of an exploration of the relationship and connection between Ada and Atticus, and I do think the story ends pretty abruptly without a whole lot of resolution, and while this is one of those stories I would expect to have a more ambiguous ending, it still feels a bit jarring and unfulfilling. But this was still fantastically bizarre. I would definitely recommend it if it sounds interesting to you, and I gave it 4.25 stars. After that, for perhaps obvious reasons, I went to my library and checked out Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This is obviously the source material for the recent blockbuster adaptation starring Ryan Gosling. It's a sort of insular sci-fi thriller, I would say, following a middle school science teacher named Ryland Grace who wakes up to find himself alone in space as the sole survivor on a desperate last chance mission to save humankind. The problem is he can't remember a single detail of what that mission entails. Content warnings for explorations of death and grief, some references to suicide and suicidal thoughts, some depictions of illness, vomit, and graphic injury, references to hard drug and alcohol use, and some instances of medicine misuse. I'm gonna hold your hand when I say this, and I'm gonna preface this by stating my truth, which is that I do not like Andy Weir's books. I have known that about myself for the past decade after reading The Martian and feeling very middle of the road about it, and I can be honest with myself and say that if the film adaptation adaptation of Project Hail Mary, which I loved, by the way, had not come out, I would have never read this. Now, I want to make something abundantly clear. It's not that I think Andy Weir is a bad writer. Obviously, he's written the scripts for both of his book-to-screen adaptations so far, and those have been very good films. There's a lot that he does really well. He knows how to write personable and charismatic narrators, he's able to balance hard science and humor, and he knows how to create high stakes. At the end of the day, the books this man is writing are perfectly serviceable, but they are simply not for me. They don't resonate for me, they don't excite me or entice me, and that is okay. I'm fully aware that I'm in the minority when it comes to this, but while people love to gush about how much science Andy Weir is able to include in his books and include in a way that feels approachable, here I just found it to be completely exhausting, endless, and fully gratuitous. It's not that the science doesn't matter or that it's not interesting, but it's shared in a way that feels very bro-y, very mansplaining, very alpha male, very much not for the benefit of the audience, so much as a way to show off that every possibility has been considered, even though lingering on the theoretical doesn't actually do anything to move the story forward. And the thing is, I know I'm not wrong, because as I said, I went to the movie, which has been an absolute box office smash, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the movie only incorporates maybe 10% of the scientific jargon and calculations, and it's actually much more successful because of it. I really and truly do not feel the need to justify myself any further on that front, but I think overall this is a perfectly serviceable story, like I said. Despite being weighed down by so much technical jargon and showboating, it is a compelling blend of mystery, survival, and first contact. And it does ask some interesting ethical questions about what we would be willing to risk if it meant potentially saving the human species. What I think the movie does really well that I wish we saw more of in the book is this exploration of how we stay hopeful when everything feels hopeless, when everything is falling apart and failing around us, when it would be easier to give in than to push through. How do we find something to fight for, and what is that intangible something that we are fighting for or holding on to? In my experience, the book is more preoccupied with proving itself scientifically viable than it is in holding up that element of the human experience to the light, and I think that's where it falls short. Again, this is not a bad book or a bad story by any stretch of the imagination. I read nearly all 500 pages with my eyeballs, and it kept my interest. But for me personally, for every pro, there was an equal and opposing con. So in the end, even though I enjoyed the film, I couldn't give the book any more than 2.5 stars. On a very different note, I then listened to Kill the Beast by Sarah Swift. This came out last fall, and I was kindly gifted a review copy from Tor Books. I also listened to the ALC I received from Macmillan Audio, which is read by Moira Quirk. This is a super whimsical, charming, queer fantasy adventure pitched as The Witcher meets Howl's Moving Castle. It's about a mercenary named Lysa whose brother was horrifically murdered by a fairy-made monster known only as the Beast. When that happened, she swore a magical oath that she would find a way to destroy this immortal creature and avenge her brother's death. But in the 13 years since, even though she's slaying countless fairies and monsters, the Beast has not yet resurfaced. One day she's contacted by Eldera Casimir de la Ronte, a melodramatic dandy with a coin purse bigger than his brain. He claims that he's not only tracked down the monster's lair, but also retrieved one of its claws, which Lysa will need in order to forge a magical sword strong enough to finally kill the Beast. Lysa assumes it's a straightforward commission that she'll take from there, but it turns out that Elderic will have to join her on the quest to gather the other ingredients needed to forge this magical weapon, or else the magic will not work. Content warnings for graphic injury and violence, including animal injury, explorations of sibling death and grief, allusions to child abandonment and an alcoholic parent, and some discussions of suicidality, as well as non-graphic references to past off-page suicide attempts. Also worth noting, both of these characters are canonically bi, and I think it's safe to say that by the end of the story, the nature of their relationship is very much queer platonic. This was so much fun to listen to. I think the comp titles are right on the money for once. The story does a great job of balancing dark fantasy with whimsical magic and a really endearing central relationship. Honestly, there's very little not to like. Something I really enjoyed about this story is that it definitely feels like a classic fantasy quest in so many ways. There are these magical ingredients the characters have to track down before ultimately facing the beast itself, but it doesn't actually feel like a long, arduous journey because the characters have a sort of safe house or home base that they can periodically return to. So the quest is kind of broken up in that way and doesn't end up feeling so impossible or overwhelming, which is really nice. I also enjoy that the story explores a kind of gender flip dynamic with the two main characters. Lysa is this huge, burly, intimidating mercenary who solves most of her problems with violence or brute force, and Elderic is the pretty delicate, gilded nobleman who lives a relatively sheltered life. They're very different, but they both have important qualities that are needed to make this journey a success. But besides the fun magic and charming narrative voice, I love what this story is doing thematically. It has a lot to say about the expansive nature of love, how being loved is an opportunity to be our fullest selves, how real love doesn't demand that we shy away from the difficult or unsavory parts of ourselves. There's a lot in here about the human urge to compartmentalize ourselves and other people, our instinct to shrink ourselves and others down to our most basic parts so that we're easier to digest. But the characters are realizing that love is an incredibly powerful force and that it's absolutely strong enough to withstand all their conflicting truths and experiences. So I love that. I love that the characters are realizing that they have space to be so much more than what they appear to be on the outside, and that they've found someone who will stand by them through all the contradictions and changes. Overall, this is just a really wonderful story. The fact that it's a celebration of friendship and deep queer platonic love just puts it over the top, in my opinion. I think I wanted a little bit more in the lead up to the climactic action, but that's a very minor note. I still gave this 4.5 stars, and I would absolutely recommend it. Then the trans rights readathon started on March 17th, so you're going to see some trans books sprinkled in here at the end, starting with Hot Girls with Balls by Benedict Nguyen. I was kindly sent a finished copy by Catapult last year, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Nikki Indris. This is a deeply unserious, zany, satirical story set during the COVID pandemic and following two Asian trans women, Six and Green, who are both professional volleyball players. But because of transphobia and gender surveillance, they both play for men's teams. They happen to play for rival teams, but they're also in a very public romantic relationship. They even do a weekly live show series online where they broadcast themselves to all their fans. And right when they're about to reunite for the championship tournament, the first in-person event since the pandemic began, two horrible real-world events happen back to back, and suddenly Six and Green's fan base is demanding for them to make official statements, and they find themselves at the heart of a full-blown PR crisis. Content warnings for experienced racism, homophobia, and transphobia, instances of misgendering, references to the COVID pandemic, explorations of transphobic murder and trans misogynoir, instances of online harassment and sexual harassment, and some explicit sexual content. This is every bit as off the wall as I expected it to be, but that's also a huge part of why I enjoyed it so much. This is definitely an ode to modern trans femininity, especially in the age of being chronically online and the trans body constantly being subjected to public discourse. This story is definitely poking fun at the experience of modern day fandom, whether it's trolling discussion boards or forming parasocial relationships with online figures or having the urge to air any and all digressions in the court of public opinion. It fundamentally understands the phenomenon and spectacle of being a trans woman of color online and in public. I really respect what this story has to say about our complex relationship with the internet age. On the one hand, information is so much more accessible, and the internet has played an important role in connecting trans people to their own transness, whether it's creating a portal through which we can see other trans people existing and thriving, finding information about different kinds of transition, or having an outlet to share our own experiences. In a lot of ways, the internet has been a net positive. But there's also the flip side to all of that, in the sense that the internet has given us what seems like unfettered access to each other. It's given us new and terrifying ways to harm each other. It's become a means of stripping away our privacy and our dignity. And of course, when it comes to any kind of harm, trans women are usually the first ones on the chopping block. This story really speaks to that and uses a satirical approach to make a statement about how so much is demanded of and expected of trans women of color especially, and how even when they give every last thing they have, it will still never be considered enough. The characters are really being pushed to the breaking point in this story, and we see how their online presence is both voluntary and involuntary, how they're forced to self-curate everything they share, and how they're expected to perform a version of themselves online that may or may not align with their actual beliefs and experiences. And the irony, of course, is that even though they're carefully curating and managing that part of their lives in an attempt to make it consumable, likable, marketable, shiny, glossy, perfect, by virtue of being trans women in this world, they will never be able to achieve that perfection they so desperately seek. So there's definitely a lot in here to think about and consider. I think it's a very successful and effective satire. I think narratively there are some threads that don't feel fully developed or properly addressed, and I do think some of the satirical online chatter also takes up a bit more space than is actually needed. So for those reasons, I would give this book a solid 4 stars. After that, I picked up my Patreon pick for March, and my patrons voted for me to read Bat Eater by Kylie Lee Baker. I listened to the audiobook audiobook, which is read by Natalie Naudus. This is a blend of horror and psychological thriller. It's also coincidentally set during the COVID pandemic and focuses on how East Asians especially found themselves the victims of all kinds of racist violence. The story begins with Cora witnessing her half-sister Delilah being pushed in front of an oncoming train after being called a bat eater. And as you can imagine, that experience completely upends her life. She changes careers and becomes a crime scene cleaner, the person who washes away and sanitizes a crime scene after the bodies have been removed. And as the Hungry Ghost Festival approaches, she can't help but notice that all her cleanups are for the murders of East Asian women. And not only that, but they keep finding bat carcasses at the sites. Content warnings for graphic descriptions of death and animal death, explorations of sibling death and grief, instances of racism and racist violence, some descriptions of gore, descriptions of post-traumatic responses, hypochondria, and obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and brief references to police brutality and police killings. I thought this was really great. This was my first time reading from this author, and it made me really excited to read more from her, especially her next release, Japanese Gothic. But I thought this story brought together elements of horror and psychological thriller in really fascinating and effective ways. I think Cora's characterization in this story is really strong and really smart. The story really captures that sense of isolation and distrust that ran rampant at the onset of the COVID pandemic, which also really lends itself to how lost and isolated Cora feels outside of that experience. She's very much a wallflower. She fades into the background, she doesn't stand out, she's too terrified to be her own person and make her own choices, and she constantly feels like everyone around her knows what the right thing to do is, while everything she does feels wrong in comparison. So there's an interesting tension there because she has this very serious, important job of cleaning crime scenes, but at the same time, she's kind of living in a suspended stage of arrested development where it feels like life is passing her by and she's almost like a child just doing what other people tell her to do and going through the motions. So there's this really great commentary regarding public erasure and invisibility, especially as it pertains to Asian women living under patriarchy, as well as a powerful rumination on how fear is both an inevitable and necessary part of life. I think there's this idea that being fearful is unhealthy, that fear is something to overcome or to silence. But we often forget that fear is an incredibly human experience, and it's also a useful survival instinct that can very well keep us alive. I feel like the story is about Cora not necessarily facing down her fear or quieting her fear, but learning how to listen to her own reactions and tune into where that fear stems from, what it's trying to tell her, because that's actually more useful than just gaslighting herself or outright ignoring her own instincts. I also really respect the angle this story takes when it comes to whether there's a big bad villain or not. I think it would have been very easy for this to be a run-of-the-mill murder mystery kind of situation, but the story subverts expectations and displays a much more nuanced understanding of systemic violence. All in all, I thought this was a really impactful story. It's suspenseful, it's dark, it's ruthless, but it still offers its characters a pathway out of the darkness. My biggest note is that I do wish the sibling relationship between Cora and Delilah was explored and complicated a bit further, but I would still give this 4.25 stars. I did another sharp 180 after that and decided to pick up Make Room for Love by Darcy Liao. I listened to the audiobook edition, which coincidentally is read by both Natalie Naudus and Nikki Endress. This is an indie-pubbed adult romance about a trans woman named Mira who is stunned when a tall, hot, butch stranger not only protects her from being harassed by her abusive ex-boyfriend at the club, but also offers to rent Mira the extra room in her apartment. Isabel, the aforementioned hot butch, is grappling with grief after losing her older sister. She also recently got out of a long-term relationship, hence why she has the extra room to offer in the first place. At first, Isabel tries to keep a polite distance from Mira, telling herself that she's just doing a favor for someone in need, but when Mira tells her that she and her fellow teaching assistants are desperate to win a union election at work, Isabel, a seasoned union organizer herself, might just have some first-hand experience to share. Content warnings for experienced infidelity and harassment, some non-graphic allusions to past experiences of emotional abuse, explorations of sibling death and grief, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Mira is an Indian-American trans woman who begins the story identifying as straight but eventually has her queer awakening, and Isabel is a Chinese-American butch lesbian. This is a really sweet, heartwarming, wholesome romance. It's a delightfully slice-of-life story as well, which means it's relatively low stakes. And the upside of there not being this huge, looming external conflict is that the everyday, simple moments the characters are sharing with each other feel that much more weighty and important. It kind of allows you to zoom in on those quiet moments of domesticity and really appreciate them for their simplicity and the role they play in day-to-day life. A walk in the park becomes an activity with a capital A. Putting furniture together becomes a bonding experience. It really puts the emphasis on the romantic stakes. This is also one of those cases where I think the central thematic concepts are being echoed and paralleled across more than one area of these characters' lives, and those conflicts are complementing each other in a way that feels natural and seamless. For example, Mira is really focused on doing all this union work with her fellow teaching assistants, which is forcing her to practice being assertive and asking for what she really wants and deserves, which is a really hard thing to do. And we also see that journey towards confidence being echoed in this budding romantic relationship, where she also has to learn how to clearly outline what she expects and what she wants. So there's a really natural and beautiful interplay between those two storylines, and it's reinforced yet again with Isabel's emotional journey as she realizes that it's not her job alone to hold everything together and do everything without also taking care of herself. I will say, because the story lacks that overarching conflict and by extension a sense of urgency, it has to then manufacture and insert conflict in order for the story to really come to a head. And I think the conflict it comes up with feels a bit forced and has the characters acting in ways that don't feel completely aligned with what we see in the first half. So I think that could have been executed much better, but I still gave this a solid 4 stars. I also read my galley of Amal El-Motar's latest short story collection, Seasons of Glass and Iron, which recently came out from Tor.com on March 24th. Like I said, this is a collection of short works from Amal El-Motar, perhaps most well known as the co-author of This Is How You Lose the Time War, and she is a storyteller and poet within her own right. These pieces are all fantastical, folkloric, fairy tale-esque, and they're told in a lot of different formats, from letters to diary entries to poems, and of course your traditional prose. Content warnings for experienced misogyny and sexism, allusions to war, including references to Israel and its various war crimes, instances of bullying, brief mentions of Islamophobia and racism, and some scenes involving death. I'll keep this fairly short and sweet. I thought this was a really strong, cohesive collection. And the interesting thing is that this is not one of those collections that has a central theme or topic or idea that holds everything together. And yet there is connective tissue between the pieces, and I think they're arranged in a way that really flows and makes sense. Amal El-Motar is just an incredibly talented writer. She has proven herself to be a master of the short form so many times over. She's co-written epistolary novels, she's written her own novellas, she's written poetry collections. She knows how to tell an emotionally evocative and thought-provoking story in a very limited amount of space. I think the high quality of every piece in this collection, whether it's a traditional story, a poem, a letter, a diary entry, is so consistent across the board, which is really rare to see in collections of short work like this, which can often err towards being really hit or miss. And I think this is one of those collections that can be very broadly enjoyed and recommended, whether you want an entryway into this author's work or you want an engaging collection of short work to transport you and spark your imagination. Either way, I think this functions as a really fantastic starting point. As with pretty much every single short story collection on Earth, there were pieces that I thought were more successful than others, but again, the consistent quality from piece to piece cannot be overstated or undersold. So I gave this a very strong 4.5 stars. And the last book I read to close out both March and the Trans Rights Readathon was my galley of Riley Dare, Slightly Witchy Sleuth by M.K. England. The author kindly sent me a review copy themselves, and this comes out from Penguin Random House on September 15th. This middle grade book is a really fun contemporary fantasy and mystery story about Riley Dare, master of solving puzzles and secret witch with just a pinch of magic that she uses to add to the ambiance of her aunt's escape room business. Riley cannot wait to debut her latest escape room, which is themed after the biggest unsolved heist in her small town's history, a heist that happened to take place the very same day she was born. But the room's unveiling is quickly overshadowed when a famous local author of children's mystery books disappears inside the room during its inaugural run. And if that weren't bad enough, Riley's magical senses are telling her that the escape room might also contain a ghost. Content warnings for references to bullying, experienced online harassment, and targeted vandalism, non-graphic references to off-page instances of police brutality, some allusions to child death, and some explorations of child abandonment and parental estrangement. I thought this was a really fun and engaging middle-grade mystery. The slightly fantastical elements give the story a fun, interesting edge, and I think there's also a really endearing core group of characters who are really easy to root for. I also love that this story is unapologetically nerdy. There are puzzles and escape rooms and D&D sessions and tarot card readings, and I think it's really cool that the characters are celebrated for those nerdy interests. And in fact, being into all of those things actually makes a difference in the case. I think Riley's friends are really wonderful. They don't have magic themselves, so they don't often fully understand where Riley is coming from, but they're still incredibly loyal and supportive to the very end. And I think it's great to see a model of friendship where friends don't need to experience something firsthand in order to believe each other and show up for each other when it counts. Another theme running throughout the story that really resonated for me was this idea of Riley learning how to build emotional boundaries for herself, fighting against the urge to stress out about her aunt's business when that's not a worry for her to carry, and allowing herself to feel the gravity of their situation without then turning around and finding a way to blame herself for those circumstances. I think that's a really important lesson, especially for younger readers, learning how to distinguish between acknowledging hard realities without then feeling like we have to shoulder those things alone, or that it's our sole responsibility to account for those things or fix those things ourselves. So there's a lot of really great ideas here all tied up in an engaging all ages mystery. My one big note is that I wish the unsolved heist that originally inspired the escape room was laid out at the very beginning of the story. I wish that lore was established right away, because I think it would have been easier to key into the mystery itself with that context. But it's withheld until almost the end of the book, which I found to be a somewhat curious choice. And kind of related to that, while I appreciate that this story holds back a few things to be explored in further books, I think it leaves maybe one too many questions unanswered, which makes it hard to say that the resolution feels fully satisfying. But I'm still excited to see where the story goes next. I would definitely recommend this for young readers or the young at heart, and I gave it a solid 3.75 stars. So there you have it. Those are the 11 books I read in March. As always, if you've read any of them yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to stop by the comments, because I would love to hear what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.